Hey Defenders, welcome back. In this video, we are going to cover part 3 of our series, which will be our log analyzer. And the open source tool that we will be using for analysis will be Wazoo. Now, Wazoo is an open source EDR solution made up of a manager and an agent and allows us to collect logs from our endpoints at scale, right? Because we don't want to have to be logging onto every endpoint to view its event logs or other system messages. That doesn't scale well, and we need a way to collectively collect all this information, run it through some log analysis, and then store it in our backend so our SOC team can review. And Wazoo is the perfect tool for that. Wazoo also includes rule sets, and these rules are what are actually analyzing your raw logs that are coming in, and that allows us to quickly spot potential malicious activity. These rules are also fully customizable, so we can create our own rules to fit our own environment. And there's a lot you can do with the Wazoo rules that we will look at in later videos. But Wazoo really gives us the freedom to kind of build out what works best for our environment, which is really awesome. So a little bit of what the architecture looks like. So we have our monitored endpoints, and Wazoo out of the box supports Windows, Mac, Linux, AWS, Linux as well. So it supports pretty much all of the common operating systems of choice, which makes our lives easier. And then it is composed of a Wazoo manager. And this is the guy that the agents will forward all of their logs to. So we'll have an endpoint agent running on, of course, our endpoints. And these guys will send all of their log. No log analysis is happening here on the agents. The agents are doing some other tasks besides collecting logs, like doing file integrity analysis, dumping out listening ports. So it is doing a little more than just log collection, but no analysis is being done on the endpoint. The Wazoo manager, after receiving the logs, will then crunch it through the rules to determine if it wants to actually trigger an alert out of this rule or not. And that's another flexibility that we have too. We can also use Wazoo to discard noisy alerts. So, every log keep in mind, every log we ingest gets stored on our backend storage, and that is taking up disk space. So for spammy alerts that may not give us much information from a security standpoint, and we don't want to bear the weight of storing those on disk for and taking up disk space from other logs, we can use our Wazoo manager to actually drop those and tune those out. And all right, so I also put together a Medium post, which I will detail in the description below if you would like to follow along with the commands that we will run. This video will cover only the installation of our Wazoo manager. I will cover the agents in our next video. And Wazoo is an EDR agent. And what this will allow us to do, you may be under the misconception that, but I have an antivirus agent running on my endpoint, I should be good, right? Well, antivirus really can only give you one side of the coin. Let's say, for example, your antivirus stops malware. You get an alert that says, hey, we've quarantined this malicious file from running. But you may have the question, how did it even get there in the first place? And that's not something an antivirus is going to provide. However, that is something that an EDR like Wazoo will provide for us. So we could watch the whole timeline of, okay, what happened before the file got onto the box? What exactly brought the file onto the box? And what program actually executed the file and attempted to get it to run? Right? So our EDR will paint us this full picture and allow us to understand the full chain of attack rather than just our antivirus saying, hey, we blocked this. With Wazoo, we will be able to collect a ton of metadata. And some of the detail that we're able to collect are network connections, commands ran, PowerShell spawns, process spawns, and so much more. We'll get into the depth of all the telemetry that we're collecting in future videos. But this just gives you an idea of how much more insight an EDR agent actually provides. So why do we pick Wazoo? Well, it doesn't just give us our log analysis. It allows us to do file integrity monitoring, vulnerability detection, helps us meet regulatory compliance standards. And I alluded to how just kind of customizable it is. right? So we're able to create our own integrations. We're able to create our own rule sets, our own decoders. We're pretty much free to add on to the Wazoo stack whatever we want, which makes it really powerful because now we can fit Wazoo to meet any use case, whether that be integrating with some other third-party APIs. So we'll get into that in later videos as well. Wazoo comes with a Python library built in that we're actually able to write our own Python code, interact with Wazoo's socket. We're actually sending what our Python scripts are collecting directly to Wazoo's socket. We're not having to write it to a file. We're able to build Wazoo rules to detect off of the data that we're collecting with our integration, and allows us to interact with just about anything, such as Office 365, Rapid7, Sentinel-1, any third-party tool that provides an API, we'll be able to interact with Wazoo. So that really opens up the door to really infinite possibilities, to be honest. Wazoo also has a really rich RESTful API that we can use to automate certain actions, such as run a vulnerability scan on this endpoint, run a active response on this endpoint. So their API supports a lot of actions that we'll get into in later videos. Another key feature is the active response. So with Wazoo, we're actually able to invoke scripts that are sitting on our endpoints to do a certain action. Maybe I want to create a local firewall rule on the endpoint to block network connections out to this known malicious IP. Maybe I want to sinkhole this particular domain on my endpoints, which we'll get into in later videos as well. We now have the ability to automate some of our responses to stop attacks, maybe right in the middle of the attack. And that's what makes Wazoo super powerful as well. We have the ability to create our own scripts that will do whatever use case we're looking to solve. All right, so now let's actually get into the installation of Wazoo. And installation is pretty straightforward. It is really not too bad. And all right, so here I am on my Wazoo manager. You can deploy the Wazoo manager on just about any Linux operating system. I am on a Debian 11 box in this tutorial. So let's first actually install our prereqs. So I will go ahead and copy these commands here. And I'm having to just jump onto GitHub because I can't copy from the Medium post yet because I haven't actually posted it. You guys following along will be able to just copy and paste directly from here. So apologies about that bouncing around. That'll just make my editing life that much more fun. All right, and we're gonna apt-get update. So with our prereqs done, now let's go ahead and actually install Wazoo. And it's as simple as one command. So they make it easy for us, which is nice. We like easy. So this will bring in our Wazoo manager and our Wazoo API. Back in the day, these used to be separate services, but they've bundled it all together into just a Wazoo manager now. But I think that happened like kind of a while ago, like with their 4.0 release. All right, our Wazoo manager is now installed. So let's go ahead and hit it with a reload. And we'll go ahead and enable this guy so that the box will start it at boot time. And then let's go ahead and start our Wazoo manager. All right, cool. That came back good. If I do a status, okay, everything's active. So the Wazoo service is actually made up of multiple different processes, and I'll just kind of quickly show you that to you guys real quick. So if I do a PSX grep for Wazoo, oh, and actually this will apply to Wazoo dashboards and the wazuh-indexer, but you should also see all of these child processes of the Wazoo manager service as well that are handling different tasks throughout Wazoo. So auth-d will handle our agents registering to our actual Wazoo manager. We have our log collector. So all of these other child processes also make up the Wazoo manager. So now with our Wazoo manager installed, we actually need to, because we're using Greylog to actually write the logs to our wazuh-indexer, we're not using FileBeat anymore. So in the past, and if you follow Wazoo's documentation, they implement FileBeat to actually forward the logs from the Wazoo manager to Greylog. To the wazuh-indexer. But we're actually going to use Greylog because Greylog will allow us to do a lot more with our logs before actually writing them to the wazuh-indexer. And to do that, we first need to stand up a listening input within Greylog. So if you followed the last video, which I'll link in the on the screen right now, I'll pop up on the screen and link in the description below right now. Please watch that video first before continuing on with this one, because this is an important step we will need to do. So I'm going to go ahead and log onto my Greylog box. So I actually have Greylog running on the same server as my Wazoo manager. In a production environment, I would not recommend this. I definitely recommend putting them on their own individual servers. So we need to first tell Greylog, hey, I want you to accept messages from our Wazoo manager. And in Greylog's terms, that is going to be us configuring a input. So I'll go ahead and click my menu, select system, and I will go down into inputs. And on my inputs page here, Greylog supports a ton of these by default, so feel free to kind of play around with these and tinker with these on your own. But in our use case, we're going to use the raw plain text TCP. So I'm going to select that guy. I'm going to select launch new input. I'll give it a title of just Wazoo events Fluent Bit, Fluent-TCP. We then set our bind address here. If you have multiple interfaces on your Greylog box, maybe one's an internal one and one's an external, then you could pick which of these interfaces you want Greylog to actually listen to receive these logs from. So you can customize it there if needed. We're going to select our port, and I'm just going to keep at 5555 as the default. This, of course, has to be a free port, so we can't have any other processes consuming this port, or we're going to have an error. You can tinker with the buffer size. You can also enable TLS. I'm not going to do that in this demo just because it'll take even more time. So, but in a production environment, I highly recommend setting your encryption. And we will go ahead and select save. And now our input is now running. So if I do my netstack command again, we see Greylog is now listening on 5555. So that's looking good. And you'll see our network, we have no input output, right? So while this port is listening, nothing is actually sending anything to it. So let's actually go ahead and change that. So we just configured our Greylog input. We're going to take advantage of a package called Fluent Bit. And what this guy is going to do, very similar to what FileBeat does, there's just some more plugins that you can do, and it interacts with Greylog a lot easier, in my opinion, than FileBeat does. So I like to use Fluent Bit in this use case. And why we are using it is because our manager, after it receives a log, analyzes it against his rule set, if there is a match, it will write it to the alerts.json file. So if I actually copy this value here and run a tail, here we'll see some of our alerts that Wazoo has analyzed. So in this case, I don't have any agents connected to this guy, so it's not going to be big. So I'm not having any wealth of logs coming in. But if I trigger a login real quick, so if I just trigger an SSH login, we should see a log populate here. And here we go. So I just logged in. We see login session opened. So every time Wazoo receives a log and says, yep, I want to store this, it will write it to the alerts.json file. So what we need Fluent Bit to do is pick up this file and send it to Greylog. And then Greylog will do our further analysis and then write it to our wazuh-indexer. Greylog provides a nice and easy install script that we'll use. So I'll just go ahead and copy and run this guy here. And that was fast. So we should now have a directory under etc called fluent-bit. And if I ls this out, you'll see our fluentbit.conf. And if I go ahead and open this guy, this will be our configuration file that we will apply our settings to send to our Greylog box. So I'm going to go ahead and edit this guy, and I have our default config already built out for you guys. So as we mentioned, the alerts.json, so this will be our input path. So this is telling Fluent Bit, hey, this is what I want you to pick up. We can add tags if you want. This is fully customizable. So if you have, multiple different Wazoo managers that you want to name, you could do that if you wanted. This alerts.json is of course in a JSON format. So we are going to use the JSON parser from Fluent Bit that comes just built in. So we don't have to do anything there. We do need to change our output though. I just called it ingest. Go ahead and paste that in there. And now we will set our port, which was 5555. And I'll go ahead and save that off. And now we should be good to enable and then start Fluent Bit. And then we'll go ahead and check out the logs to make sure that we are connected. We're going to var log td agent bit.log. And okay, we see our workers started, so that looks good. If I now go back into Greylog, and so see we have still no network IO, but let's see if we can change that. So I'll go ahead and log on to the box again, and now we should see this guy bump up. And sure enough, now we are at 1.9 kilobytes, which was how much data was sent as part of this SSH login. So we've now verified that we are receiving, that our Wazoo manager is actually forwarding its logs to Greylog. And if we go ahead and show extracted messages, we can see our logs here. Really quickly, what we will get into in the next Greylog video is that you notice that this message field is not parsed at all. It's all one blob, and that's stored as message. So we will tell Greylog how to JSON decode this in the next Greylog video. So stay tuned for that one. So we have now deployed our Wazoo manager, and we have connected it to Greylog and have verified that we are sending our alerts.json file to Greylog. However, the Wazoo installation by default doesn't have all of the configurations that I would recommend enabled by default. So in this last part of this video, I just want to take you some of the few kind of config tweaks that I always like to do with every manager installation. And the first is going to be creating a registration password. So Wazoo is now listening for, so our Wazoo manager is now listening for agent registrations on port 1515. So an agent will say, hey, I want to register with you. The manager will say, okay, I'll allow you. And here is your client key. And it'll generate a client key and pass that to the agent. And that's what will encrypt all of the communication going forward between the two. But at the moment, that's just a blind acceptance. So any agent that tries to connect to 1515, our Wazoo manager will register it. And we want to go ahead and change that. We want to add some security around that and actually tell our Wazoo manager that any agent that tries to connect has to provide the correct password. So let's go ahead and enable the password authentication option, and we'll be able to create our own password. So I'm going to go ahead and open up the osec.conf file, which is the main configuration file that we'll use for anything Wazoo. I'll go ahead and scroll down to the auth block here, and I'll go down to use password, and instead of no, I will go ahead and change that to yes. I'll go ahead and save that out, and now let's go ahead and set our own password by creating this authd.pass. So I'll go ahead and copy this command here, and I will replace custom password with my own. I'll just say, please subscribe. All right, so now this file should exist and should contain my password. Yep, that looks good. Now let's go ahead and change the file permissions and ownership so that the Wazoo process is actually able to read it. All right, that looks good. So we now have password authentication enabled. Now let's enable the vulnerability detection. So Wazoo can also do vulnerability analysis for us on our endpoints. That's another benefit of of Wazoo, but we need to actually go ahead and enable that first. So I'm going to open up again my osec.conf file. I'll scroll down to my vulnerability detector block here, and you'll see that enabled is set to no. So let's go ahead and revert that to yes. There are some scan options you can tweak that's provided further in Wazoo's documentation, so you can go ahead and check that out. And then we also need to enable all of the operating systems that we want to run the vulnerability detector on. So Wazoo will be able to enumerate the operating system that the Wazoo agent is running on, and will then use that to run its vulnerability detections. But I need to go ahead and enable these to yes for any of these that I want to set. And okay, good. So that looks good. So I'll go ahead and save and close that file. Now, the other thing I like to do is configure individual agent group files based on the operating system of my endpoints. So for example, any of my Linux endpoints will get this group config file, and any of these in any Windows endpoints will get this group config file, because within these config files will be different file integrity monitoring settings, different paths to log files. So I like to keep these separate, and Wazoo gives us the ability to centrally maintain these. So anytime I make a change to a group config file, that will automatically get pushed out to the agent. So it enables us to manage our agents' configs in a scalable fashion, which is really nice. So to do this, I actually like to go onto the Wazoo web UI. You will see this error pop up, and this is because Wazoo is expecting this index pattern, which we haven't set yet. So disregard this error message for now. We can we'll deal with it later. But I'll go ahead and go into settings. We can still interact with the Wazoo's web app here, even with that error. So we don't really need to worry about it at the moment. I'll go into management. I'll go into groups. And then here we have just this default group, which you actually can't delete. So this guy always has to exist. But I'll go ahead and create a new group, and I'll just call it Linux. Now I will copy the Linux group. So go ahead and copy, and I'll go ahead and select the pencil on this new group and erase all that and paste that there. Save that off. So we got files successfully added. So Wazoo has now created this new group for us. And so any agents we put in this group will get the configuration that we apply here. And again, any changes that we make, Wazoo will auto restart the agent for us and apply those new settings. So I'll also do the same for Windows. And all right, that's looking good. Now, the last thing, we need to restart our Wazoo manager to actually apply all these settings that we did, such as the registration password and setting the vulnerability detector, and enabling the vulnerability detector. So I'll go ahead and restart our Wazoo manager. And then once that restarts and comes back up, we'll then add our advanced custom rules. So if you haven't checked out one of our previous posts, we do have a GitHub repo. We do have a GitHub repo called Wazoo Rules that has some of our custom rules that we've built out and are wanting to share back to the community. That Wazoo by default doesn't have the best default rule sets. And so we've put some work into creating these, what we call quote unquote advanced custom rules that are categorized to fit whatever integration you're looking to fit. Maybe you want to bring in Office 365 alerts. Well, now you have rules that are also enriched with MITRE IDs. So just kind of give you that extra enrichment and are actually set to appropriate rule levels. Go ahead and check that out if you like. But I always like to include these as part of my base install of Wazoo. And we have actually put together a script. And I have put together a bash script that you can just copy and run this guy, and it will bring in all of the alert, and it'll bring in all of the rules and decoders that are stored within this repo. Word of caution though, that this will replace your custom Wazoo rules. So if you've already built some of your own custom rules, I highly recommend taking a backup before running the script, and also make aware of the rule IDs. There can't be any conflicting rule IDs. So just also make sure of that. So just fair warning there. So I'll say yes, I want to continue. Oh, I don't have Git installed, so I'll go ahead and install that real quick. You don't need to install Git. If it hasn't been found, then you'll get a little message saying that you need to install it. So go ahead and say yes. And so now the script is cloning this repo, bringing these rule files in, and is modifying the file ownership and permissions so that Wazoo is able to load them correctly. So we've downloaded it, and now we are restarting the Wazoo Manager service and verifying that it comes back in a healthy state. And cool, our Wazoo Manager service has come back healthy. If we cd into var osec etc rules and ls this out, we now see all of our custom rules that we brought in, and then these are also viewable within the web UI as well. So if I go into manage rules, custom rules, we see all of our custom rules here. So that looks good. So, all right, we now have our Wazoo Manager installed. We've connected it to Greylog. We have made some configuration tweaks, and our Wazoo Manager is now in a place for us to proceed to install our Wazoo agents, which we will cover in the next video. So I think that wraps it up for this one. I appreciate you guys hanging out with me, and I will see you in the next one.